Hi, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for being here. It does feel like the crack of dawn, and so I'm really impressed and grateful that all of you made it this morning, and hope you've had some time for coffee. My name is Ella Orfrey, and I'm Deputy Editor of Granta Magazine, and this morning I'm delighted and very grateful to the British Council and the Centre for Literary Translation for inviting us here to discuss publishing Chinese writing in the UK. I'm lucky enough to have made a trip to China at the end of last year, and Granta Magazine, as a result of the connections we made there, teamed up with the wonderful people at Shanghai 99, and we'll be publishing our first Chinese language edition of Granta Magazine this August. And so I'm particularly interested to be here this morning to talk about how, in any kind of new market, bringing writers together from one tradition and one language, indeed, to another is always quite difficult. But as many of you here will be aware, it also has its rewards. During my trip to China, I was constantly struck by the apologetic tone of publishers when they would describe very modest print runs of about 80,000 to start off with. And the numbers are dazzling enough from anyone from our small island. With a population of more than 1.3 billion people, China is the world's most populous country. 1 in 5 of us is Chinese. 1 in 5 of us human beings is Chinese. And with more and more of the population learning English from a very young age, the translation of English language text into Chinese is a booming business. And this morning we're going to talk about what happens the other way around. Many, but not certainly news-making numbers of people are learning Chinese Mandarin throughout the world. And as we join the discussion about the market focus at the London Book Fair this year, I'm delighted to be joined by 3 experts who are well placed to discuss the challenges, benefits, and perhaps the joys of publishing Chinese writers in the UK. Marisha Juskevich,
that was very good.
It was very good, thank you. Is the founder and owner of the Hong Kong-based P&E Literary Agency and has extensive experience of publishing in both the UK and Asia. Previously head of literary management for Hong Kong Media Group Creative Work, Marisha has achieved the sale to Random House of Tzu Tong's short story collection, The Mad Woman on the Bridge, and his novel, The Boat to Redemption, which went on to be named winner of the prestigious 2009 Man Asia Literary Prize. The P&E Literary Agency has successfully sold many works in China, including The Fat World to Transworld, by Chang Kun-chung, which is sold into over 15 languages. The Flowers of War to Random House by Yang Geiling, and also 1988 by Han Han, China's most famous blogger, and also famous motorcyclist, is that right?
Oh, yeah. He's famous for so many things. Car racing, blogging, films, music, you name it, and writing.
And writing. Before living in Hong Kong, Marisha worked for several UK publishers. She graduated in Mandarin Chinese from Durham University. My second guest is Julia Lovell, who teaches modern Chinese history and literature at Birkbeck College, University of London. She is the author of The Politics of Cultural Capital, China's Quest for a Nobel Prize in Literature, and The Great Wall, China Against the World, as well as a book titled The Opium War, Drugs, Dreams, and the Making of China. Julia's translation of modern Chinese fiction include Han Xiongong's A Dictionary of Maquo. You'll have to forgive my awful pronunciations and correct them. Zhu Wen's I Love Dollars and Other Stories of China, and Lu Xun's The Real Story of IQ and Other Tales of China. Finally, we're joined by Ra Page, the founder and managing editor of Comma Press, one of the UK's most prolific publishers of short fiction. He's also the coordinator of Regional Development Agency for Independent Publisher Literature Northwest, and works as a commissioner across a number of short film projects. Ra has previously worked as a journalist. Since its inception in 2002, Comma Press has published more than 36 short story collections. That's just so brave. Making it one of the leading publishers of short fiction in the UK. Please join me in welcoming Marisha, Julia, and Ra. So I thought we'd structure our conversation this morning around the journey of the book. And Marisha, I'd like to start off with you as the the beginning of the whole process. You're one of the very first people to open an agency representing Chinese writers to the rest of the world, bringing them to English language and other audiences. Can you tell us a little bit about your agency? I'm especially interested in finding out why you started it and how you saw the market.
Thank you, Ella. Well, I started the agency mainly because I was interested in China, having my background, but it was really to show the diversity of voices in China and the different genre, the different writing, the different styles that exist in China. There weren't, when I opened up, it was originally creative work, there were very few author representation agencies, so I was one of few. There are more now, but that was really the main aim, was really to show the diversity of voices, because there's a stage where most of the literature that we were reading in translation earlier on was mainly historical, and that's what the Western audience was particularly interested in. So I've looked at both historicals, thrillers, crime, different age groups, and tried to present that in translation, be it in English or in European languages. So that's really my why affected both interest, and to show that there's so much in China. Not all of it can be, I think, translated effectively, but
That's interesting, yeah.
yes, not everything can potentially sit in translation, but to try and present as much as possible.
Marisha, when you say that you wanted to show that diversity, I just wondered, does this mean that there was a development of literature with things changing in Chinese literature at a certain point that made an agency like yours possible? Or was it just no one had ever looked before?
Well, I think that there weren't. I mean, I suppose if you go back in history in China, so much has happened. The Cultural Revolution basically stopped so much. So people, I think, continued to write after that, but not many people were then, after that, looking and actively taking literature out. So that's what made it possible. And then the next stage is actually finding translators to reflect those voices.
Okay, I'm really interested in that last thing you said in your response, where you said not everything is translatable, or I think the euphemism we use in publishing is it doesn't travel well. Can you speak a little bit more about what works and what doesn't work and why?
Well, I think effectively it's a good story, and a story, if we talk about fiction for the moment, a story that will work across the boundaries worldwide, which isn't easy, I think, in any culture. And then within Chinese culture, it is fairly specific. So there are a lot of books in China that are selling extremely well and very much speak to a Chinese audience, but don't necessarily, they just wouldn't work, I think, either in English or in any other European language. So I think it's fundamentally good stories, good characters, and I suppose often, since I agent, a hook, something that I can initially pull agents in and explain it in a very succinct way, and that would be the starting point.
Can you speak sort of quite specifically about how you go about finding writers? Who are you talking to? What are you reading? How do they come to you?
Well, initially, when I first started about 5-6 years ago, it was just, had no website, no business card, and it was getting people to trust me to look after their work. But now after it's like any industry, I think it's a network. People hear of what I do and they approach me, and other writers hear of the agency, and then their friends here. So it's very much word of mouth. It's a small. It is, though China's huge, it's a small industry in its own way.
And how did things work before? I mean, the writers who were being translated without agents, because I know that there are very few agents and you were one of the first. How did writers find their outside audiences before that?
Well, I think before it was difficult in the sense, just on a practical level, the things that I do is translate so much material into English, just day-to-day material from, say, your editor. I translate the contracts and negotiate those and translate all of that into English as well. Now I think English is more prevalent. Now it's potentially easier, or an author maybe finds someone who can help translate the material. And then also there's much more English now. So Now I've forgotten what you were asking, actually.
No, I was asking how it had worked before, but that answers the
Yes,
question.
yes. I mean, there generally, and you've probably seen in China, there is much more English. You can see that within the publishing houses in China today. Whereas, say, 5 years ago, I never actually saw or met bilingual rights people within publishing houses. That's fairly prevalent now. You have people who are employed within mainland publishers who can speak 3 or 4 languages. So I suppose it's with China opening up more, so things potentially become easier and more fluid and
Julia, this is probably a good point to bring you in. Once the match has been made once Marisha has done her work and brought publisher and author together, the really hard work of translation begins. As well as writing about China, I think it's probably fair to say that you're regarded as one of the foremost translators into English from Chinese. And going back to what Marisha said earlier on, do you think that some things are impossible to translate?
Inevitably. I mean, we have to be realistic about this, that Chinese literature and language have evolved and developed in ways that are culturally, historically, geographically very remote from those of European languages. So when I translate, actually, I find the greatest challenge is not just the linguistic challenge of, what does the Chinese mean? How can I put this clearly into English so at least it's comprehensible, because there are so many Chinese friends I can ask, or if the author is alive you can ask the author, obviously. The big problem is translating broader ideas expressed within the work itself about characterization, plot development, humor, and so on. All these things can be set up in Chinese in ways that if you translated them directly, structurally, into English readers would not understand perhaps why you were bothering to translate this work. If you translated them directly, you would not convince Anglophone readers that this was something worthwhile in the original language. And a very specific example of this, I guess, is regards to the setting up of jokes, punchlines, humour, which is so particular to each language. So a couple of years ago, I was involved in a Chinese-English literary translation course, and I was working with a group of early career translators, and we had in the room a very, very well-established, critically acclaimed Chinese author who does a combination of comic writing and very politically engaged writing. So a very, very successful man in China. And we were trying, I won't mention the name, but you can take it from me, this is a very, very sort of well-established, acclaimed writer. And we were translating the first 2 or 3 pages of a comic novel that he'd written. So we did this translation, and then just so happened that on the course there were also English language writers who were involved in a parallel course. So there were English-Chinese translators learning from those writers. So for one session, a well-known British comic novelist came and effectively was an editor for our sample translation of this first 3 pages of this comic novel. And effectively, she tore it to shreds. Well, not tore it, but she completely rearranged the structure of it. She said, she looked at it and said, look, the punchline's on page 3. My editor would never let me get away with this. Put the joke at the top or you're losing the reader. So that's just a very concrete example of how I think translators and editors, and this is not actually often, I think, taken into account with the budgets allowed for time and money for commissioning translations from Chinese into English. Translators really and editors have to expect to roll up their sleeves and really do something often quite radical with these texts, because the ideas about things like storytelling and plot and jokes.
Can I just ask, actually, how important do you think in the work that you do is your relationship with the author when you're translating? So when you're coming across these issues, I mean, I wonder, I suppose one doesn't have a sense of comparison of any other language, but my impression is that the relationship with the author you're translating, if it works, really helps then make the book work. Or am I wrong there?
I mean, for a bit of personal disclosure, I have never done anything as radical as what this British comic writer wanted to do, because my background is in Chinese literature, so I am, in my DNA, I'm kind of conditioned to respect these texts. However, if the writer is alive, certainly these relationships are very important. If the writer is not alive, I tend to be incredibly respectful of the original, obviously. But one example was of a novella I translated, which was very, very interesting premise, but obviously written incredibly quickly. So there were a lot of internal discrepancies, even within chapters, not from one chapter to another, in terms of time and description. At one point, the descriptives of face and so on, of facial expression, often seemed very odd. I mean, at one point, a character is described as having blushed so hard that she illuminated the facade of the house next door, and I thought, is this magical realism or is this just sloppy writing? And so I queried these things with the author, and the author ended up just saying, look, do what you have to do to make it work in English.
So effectively you're also editing in some ways. I mean,
Yes.
your role as in Chinese literature, that I suppose that's another issue perhaps for later on, is where your line, where are you translator and where are you editor?
And there are just very different also production values and editorial values I've discovered between Literary China and Literary UK. My experience of publishing in the UK has always been incredibly positive.
Yes.
That editors are incredibly diligent, both in the kind of the structural edit and the copy edit. Many Chinese writers and Chinese editors say that Chinese editors and publishing houses relatively rarely do that kind of detailed work. In fact, some authors will say they refuse to allow editors to touch their work. They'll allow them to correct spelling mistakes, but nothing to do with structure,
Yeah, I mean, that's
which is so important.
That's a fundamental that Julie's just raised.
It's really interesting, because I think a lot of what you're describing is that you need, as a translator, so much more than the language. You need a cultural understanding, but also quite an in-depth understanding of the whole industry. And I guess I do have a question though. I've worked with translations from Spanish and Portuguese and so on, and some of the things you're describing sound familiar already. Do you think that those things are even more so for translating from Chinese than they are from any other language? Does it have something to do with what you were saying earlier on about that development of a tradition far away from any kind of European language at all?
I wonder if it's more to do with the very specifics of Chinese domestic culture over the last 20 or 30 years, that this is a culture still in the process of very radical transformation. I mean, the example that Marisha raised right at the beginning of her writer Han is very typical. He's not just an author, he's a blogger, he's a musician, he's a racing car driver. And this is very, very typical for Chinese writers. They might write for a few years or even a few months, and then they'll drift off to something else. There is far less stability of professional value. So on the one hand, you have this scene which is quite dazzling in its creativity and its versatility. You know, so many of my Chinese writer friends, they're not just writers, they're filmmakers or they're publishers or they're curators and so on. It's quite dazzling. But on the other hand, I sometimes think there's less professional stability than there is for certain UK writers. You know, like an Ian McEwan or a Julian Barnes, who, you know, they'll expect to spend 2 or 3 years on a novel. That's fine. Whereas many very acclaimed Chinese novelists, they will very openly say that they have shunted a first draft into print. I think one novelist, very famous novelist, who he's rumoured to have written a 500,000 word novel by hand in 43 days.
Dear Lord. Ra, I'd like to bring you in at this stage and just talk about Julia's raised quite a lot of the particular difficulties of translating from Chinese, but I wonder for you as a publisher, when you go about finding text to translate for Comma Press, where do you look for these texts, and what are the difficulties you find when you are working? Let's just start with the idea of translation in general.
I should probably own up right at the start that I'm not an expert in Chinese fiction. With Common, we've put together a series of anthologies that bring short fiction translation from different regions. And one of our strengths, I suppose, is that we sometimes are prepared to admit that we're not experts. And we work very hard in finding the right people to work with and to delegate to. For me, it's really, really important to have a direct contact with the author, even if you don't speak the language of the author, and even if the author doesn't speak your language. And it's very important to sometimes sidestep the third parties that may get in the way of that conversation, that relationship.
But how does it happen? How do you make that contact?
Well, it differs from book to book. So with Xi Chang, which is a new collection of short stories from urban China, I kind of spread out a network of feelers and questions and looking for advice from different translators, people working in the industry. I talked to dozens and dozens of key experts. And I was also very, very lucky in that I made contact with and sort of made an alliance with a couple of people working in visual arts in China, in Beijing. And they were very closely aligned to one particular writer, Han Dong, who had himself been an editor of a magazine called They in Beijing, which was in Nanjing, sorry, which was very, very sort of influential in supporting writers who were outside of the mainstream and the literary establishment in China. A lot of poets, a lot of short story writers, and it's kind of those writers that you wouldn't imagine, that you wouldn't see in the normal selections of official Chinese kind of authors of that generation.
How long did it take you to put something like this together? It's so impressive.
Well, I talked about it for about 3 years. And I never knew if it would actually happen. And I got great advice from Julia, from Anna Holmwood, from Nikki Harman, from lots and lots of people I've met at this fair. But it kind of clicked into place when I met these two artists, this artist-curator pair, Liu Ding and Carol Lingwei Yu.
Ra, did you have a very strong idea of what was going to work for your audience and what you were looking for, or did you just go looking?
Diversity is what we're always looking for, and kind of pluralism, and short stories that actually kind of build on the fact that they are short stories. They're not just pieces of fiction that happen to be short. I was very keen to look for short stories that played with form, played with structure, and did things which were unique to the short story. That's what I'm interested in as an editor generally with Common Press. So it was kind of short stories that were really short stories.
And what has the reception been? How have the stories been received? And perhaps give us a comparison with other languages translated from, so we can think about.
So this book is being launched tomorrow at the British Library. So it's very, very early days in terms of the reception. But in terms of people that have read it, I think so far we're all quite amazed by the ingenuity of some of the stories. There's a story by a writer called Diao Dao, who's based in Shenyang, who uses a kind of a Borgesian approach to Orwellian political satire, which I didn't expect, and is absolutely astonishing and mind-blowing. There's a really, really interesting writer from Hong Kong called Ho Si-tung, who plays with kind of unexpected ghost story tropes. There's all kinds of different varieties and strands. Han Dong has obviously been particularly critical and important for this project, and he is somebody who's come from poetry, and I'm always interested in the relationship between poetry and short fiction, because it's all about the gaps, and it's about what's not said, and how the text sort of fades to black very quickly, and how the narrative works with that.
Yes. No, go ahead.
What was the most challenging thing, would you say, in putting this collection together, working in China?
I'd say finding the right person or people on the ground in China. That's always the biggest the hurdle.
Ra, I'm interested. I want to go to that point exactly, because you said you were quite keen to work without the person in the middle. but if you're not fluent in
Yeah.
Chinese and you don't, Julia's just sort of talked about how you do need to know a culture and a way of being. How on earth does someone who wants to publish Chinese literature even start? I mean,
Well, obviously you need brilliant translators, and we've been very blessed with those people like Julia, Nikki, and Eric, and lots of others. You need to have the very best translators. But to some extent, I might be being a little bit controversial here. But as an editor, it's almost to my advantage to not have the language. Once you know that you're working with a very, very good translator, because you can then look at a text completely fresh, and you can see sometimes when things aren't working.
Yes.
So you just look at it as an English narrative, and the things which aren't working may be idiosyncrasies of the original language, but they may be things which are kind of not been put into the right order, or not been kind of put together correctly, or in a way which works. So although I am kind of working blind, I don't think that's necessarily always a disadvantage.
Julia, can I ask you to come in and sort of respond to what Raz said?
I just wanted to say that I think that Ra's volume that he's put together here is particularly significant because, of course, UK and American publishers, they're particularly fixated on finding Chinese novels for economic reasons. So the short story is not a form that is at all easy to publish in the UK. But I would argue that it's in the short story that you see contemporary Chinese writers doing their best work. You know, as I mentioned, this is a culture in sort of radical transition. It's changing all the time. People are hopping professions. I mean, I often think that China, it's a terribly exciting place to go to, but it also sometimes seems like a place suffering from chronic attention deficit disorder because people are just so busy hopping from one thing to another. I mean, I've never managed to write anything in China ever. I mean, when I'm in China, I'm just too busy meeting people, chasing up leads. It's only when I come back to boring provincial Cambridge that I can actually sit down and write anything at all. So China at the moment, I feel, is not necessarily a place which encourages the kind of investment in craft and technical design that is so important to the successful long novel. However, the short story is just ideal for this society as it is at the moment.
And digital downloads as well. I mean, it's perfect.
Yeah, and it's, you know, it's short enough for a writer to capture a very intense personal fragment of this completely confounding society, but it's not long enough for them to reach for sort of melodramatic plot twists and, you know, things that lose the confidence of the reader.
So do you think that with that sort of focus that British publishers have on novels for the economic reasons that you sort of hinted at, do you think that means that we're not getting the most exciting things that are happening, or is that what you're saying?
I think we're not getting the most exciting and the most technically accomplished things. Because if you think about the novel in China, if we're trying to understand it in the sense of the modern Western sort of psychological realist novel, this is a very young genre still.
Yes.
It's barely 100 years old. Obviously, Imperial China has its own novels, but very different from, you know, the Jamesian novel or the, you know, the Jonathan Franzen novel. You know, if you put Freedom next to a novel from the traditional, you know, the imperial Chinese canon, you find it hard to think that these were in fact the same literary form. And so it's and if you look at the last 100 years of Chinese history, this is a period of, you know, rupture, cultural, political rupture upon rupture. So it's been very difficult for authors, I think, to settle down, to really get their heads around the long fiction form. Whereas the short story, as I say, it's short enough for people to have mastered.
But I think
Marisha, sorry, can I ask you a question before you jump in? I want to ask you specifically about your selling in of Chinese writers. I'd like you to speak a little bit about the responses you get from publishers, taking into account what Julia has said about what's happening with the short story in China as opposed to novels, because I assume that most of your work is trying to sell in novels and indeed bodies of work by writers. And can you tell us a little bit about the reception and the successes you've had, and also what you find most difficult, I guess?
Well, I think fundamentally it's, at the end of the day, the publisher who will take the novel will either take it to have prestige on their list. So I think that's happening less and less. I mean, publishers just can't afford to do that, I think, anymore. So then the book has to sell. So there are a lot of interesting novels in Chinese, but if the publisher feels it's not going to sell, they're not going to take it. So I come in and try and make it sound a more commercial prospect that they will sell a certain number of copies, even though, I mean, that's the difficulty, I think.
Does that mean that the novels, doesn't that mean that literary works suffer at the expense of sort of more obviously commercial novels that perhaps tell us things that we already know? I mean, does that affect the quality, do you feel, of the things that you can sell in to publishing houses?
I think so. I mean, it does limit what publishers will take, because at the end of the day, they're running businesses, so they need to feel, though it's interesting, they need to sell copies at the end of the day.
Julia, do you see that at all with the things that you're being asked to comment on or to translate? Do the more, I guess, difficult literary works suffer because they're not as obviously sellable?
I'll talk about perceptions in China about what tends to get taken up by UK or American publishers. I get the sense there's a strong feeling in China, a strong dissatisfaction among some people about what kind of literature gets sold and bought up by UK and American editors. I think that many Chinese editors and writers feel that in order to appeal to Western audiences, a book has to have a controversial USP, a maidian, a unique selling point, and usually that's sex or politics or ideally both. So I think the perception in China is that there is a large body of technically accomplished work that is getting ignored because getting ignored in terms of getting into translation because it's seen as insufficiently controversial by editorial boards on the big publishers in the UK and the US that can afford the publicity budget to really make a book work.
It's effectively, I suppose, it's how a publisher can place a Chinese novel. That's what I'm asked again and again. An editor said, well, it sounds really interesting, but, I'm going to go to my acquisition meeting. I've got to convince my whole sales and marketing team. And how am I going to pitch it? I know it sounds interesting, but what are the hooks to this book that's really going to get people like the sales team on board and excited?
So Ra, is this what your collection is trying to counter?
Certainly, there is a series of preconceptions about Chinese literature and about Chinese culture and the freedoms enjoyed or not enjoyed by Chinese writers. And when you bring any number of writers together, you immediately realise that these preconceptions just don't apply. I'm interested by what you're saying about kind of finding a controversial hook. I wonder if it's a controversial hook or if it's just something which feeds into our perceptions and our preconceptions about what's controversial. I often find that sometimes what's really controversial, what's really interesting is the way a writer can subvert those expectations. And I think the challenge for publishers and editors and marketers is to try and turn that into the story and to try and turn that into the hook. A few years ago, we did an anthology, just talking about a different language for a moment, we did an anthology of Middle Eastern stories called Medina. I have a copy here. And one of the writers that we found very fortuitously through that was a refugee Iraqi writer who wasn't even published in Arabic, who'd ended up in Finland, called Hassan Blasim. And his collection was all about the Iraqi experience over the last 20, 30 years through living under Saddam Hussein, the occupation and the refugee experience. And from our point of view, his narrative was completely unique in terms of what's available for English readers. His story, his USP, was astonishing because it was a first-hand, very, very genuine, authentic perspective.
And do you feel you found that with any writers in your new collection of Chinese literature?
I think we're beginning to. I think it's the early stage really for us. The idea of these anthologies is to try and find writers that we want to work with over a longer period, and to try and convince readers and booksellers and the market generally that this is something which isn't available elsewhere.
It's really encouraging hearing you talk about sort of that long-term investment. I'd like to spend a little bit of time sort of asking all three of you about the future of publishing Chinese literature. And Marisha, I'd like to start with you. As well as sort of hearing if at all things are starting to change in your selling into American and British publishers, and as well as other countries, do tell us if there's any writer in particular you're really excited about who you think can sort of start the shift going. Thinking particularly about this idea of the more commercial, the more expected being easier to put across, and the more technically accomplished literary works being difficult.
That's an interesting question. I think what will be interesting and what publishers seem particularly interested in at the moment is writing that's coming from the younger generation in China. And I don't think there is that much out there yet in translation from China. So I suppose I'm obviously going to say Han Han. Mm-hmm. I mean, he is huge in China. Now, whether that's going to then transfer to the West in translation will be very interesting. I think it'll be very interesting seeing Simon & Schuster publish him second half of this year and how he's taken by an audience in the West. But I think that something that, as I say, I think the thing to look at is what the younger generation are producing. And there are mixed, I think, thoughts from people on what they think on what's being written by the younger generation in China. But I think that's the spot to watch now, as well as looking at the established writers who are so talented and can write a great story, but as I say, a younger generation. But can I just backtrack just very, very briefly to something that we were saying before, and I think it's important. So we're talking about short stories, which I think is also a very good thing to be doing with Chinese literature, because it does give you sort of kind of sound bites, not sound bites, but a taster of the writing that's happening in China. So I think if publishers could take short stories from China, it will then at least kind of reflect what's being written out there. The second thing is whether publishers will take them. But this is such a great idea. Because the other issue, I think, with translation is if you're translating a full-length novel, it's such a time commitment for a translator. Translation isn't particularly well paid. And for those younger translators, it's such... That's the other difficulty. So just on a very practical level is the finances, if you're doing something, as you know.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So...
Julia, that idea of sort of the commercial imperative sort of, I guess, causing what we would think of as literary good to suffer. I was thinking last night that maybe 12 years ago we wouldn't have been able to predict that Scandinavian crime would be selling bucket loads in Tesco. And I just wonder if you... Selling bucket loads in Tesco doesn't sound great. Anyway, I just wonder if you have any kind of idea of where things will be going with Chinese literature, whether we'll be going that way, whether there'll be one genre that will make us all feel like this is something familiar that we want to read more and more of, or if you see any of the shift that Marisha's talking about. And do talk about any concerns you have as well.
At the risk of sounding pessimistic, I mean, I don't think there are any magic bullets which are suddenly going to launch Chinese literature and culture into the mainstream. I think we're looking at a gradual change here. I started translating 10 years ago, and back then to translate, for someone like me from Middle England, to translate Chinese fiction into English was seen as a very weird, marginal thing to do. I mean, very well-educated people would come up to me and say, gosh, does China have any literature? So it was a very, very marginal thing to do back then. Things have definitely changed in the last 10 years, and thanks to people like Marisha, like Ra, and Granta, I know, are doing a lot of work in China, which is all wonderful. However, I do sense that there is still, certainly in the UK, probably in the US still, a certain impatience with the idea that Chinese culture is a story. Chinese culture and literature are things which are worth taking time to understand. I think that most people would accept that the Chinese economy, the Chinese political system, it's important to understand. But people still feel that that can be done through reading headlines, reading a few pie charts on GDP and so on. The actual idea of investing time to understand Chinese culture, not just in the modern sense, but of course the roots. You know, you can't understand Zadie Smith unless you've read Dickens. I mean, you wouldn't read just contemporary UK writers without having a hinterland. And I think certainly amongst friends and acquaintances, it remains acceptable to be culturally ignorant about China in the way that it is not acceptable to be ignorant about, say, Russian culture or Indian culture, or even, to take an East Asian analogue, Japanese culture. Educated general readers, they can conjure with names like Murakami or Banana Yoshimoto in a way that they can't conjure with Mo Yan, Yu Hua, and so on. So I think we still do need a paradigm shift in the minds of UK and American readers, this sense that, yes, the Chinese economy and political system is important, but we have to understand the much deeper cultural, literary, linguistic structures behind these contemporary phenomena.
I think this is probably a really good point to open things up to the audience. I can see that there's some microphones around, and with everything that's going on, we probably need them. But I'd like to invite the members of the audience to ask questions, or if you have experience yourself of publishing Chinese literature into English. Anyone want to kick things off? Yes, please, the gentleman in the front. Wait for the microphone.
Thank you. I'm a journalist from China, and I want to know how many books are sold in average Chinese literature. Can you tell me?
In translation in the UK?
Yes.
I could not tell you that. What I can tell you is that the proportion of books published in the UK and the US each year that are translations from all languages is meant to be 2% of the total, but that's from all languages. So obviously the proportion of that tiny proportion which is from Chinese will be tinier still. But perhaps Marisha will have the figures.
Yeah, I mean, so far with my experience, Chinese authors do best actually in the export territories. So outside, say, UK and US, and they do pretty well actually. And
do you mean Australia, New Zealand?
Yeah, Australia, New Zealand, Asian territory, so in English language. And they do really well. And what really helps, which I've found actually, is when you have large publishers, say, based in Asia, who can really help promote those writers, which the experience that I've had recently, they know. So basically you have, say, my Chinese author, and I have a question, how are we going to promote him in, say, Singapore? And they're on the ground. They have good sales and marketing experience, and that's really helpful. So I haven't given you numbers, but...
Marisha, that's a really interesting point, though, because surely it can't just be about publicity. Surely there's something else going on that means that the works are doing well in those export territories. Is there something about readers, or indeed publishers, within the sort of the more mainstream established territories that means that we don't understand or don't want to understand or engage with the literature if the works are doing so much better elsewhere?
Well, I suppose because fundamentally the authors are often, say, in Asia, and I think it does help if they go out and talk, or they go to the festivals, and it does, each little bit helps. So if they go to the Singaporean Literary Festival or in Hong Kong, so they're there, and there's, I suppose, the readers understand in those territories. And then with the extra kind of push of having the publisher there helping and placing and speaking to the booksellers while we have bookshops is helpful. So I think that's probably what's missing. I mean, that's always the case with I think potentially publishing in the UK and the US is promoting these books, having the channels which are bilingual, which is just beginning, like a lot of things. I mean, it's all going in the right direction, but it's going to take time. I think it's going to take time for it to work. So I haven't given you numbers, but I've given you an idea.
Okay. Any other questions? The gentleman at the back.
Hi there, Mike Jakeman from The Economist. I just wanted to pick up on Julia's point about cultural ignorance. Certainly, we do a lot of pie charts on China, and they're very well received. But I wonder about sort of literature as a whole, and whether or not it's more up to publishers to produce and find and create these novels that will then spark public interest, as opposed to waiting for the public to decide that they want to read some Chinese literature and then providing it. I wonder whether, maybe this is a cynical view, but perhaps it's a bit more up to publishers to take the lead, to show readers what is out there that they could read, and let the readers' word of mouth do the rest.
It's an excellent question. I'd like Julia and Ra perhaps to answer, but Julia, would you start?
I have a subscription to The Economist. I love pie charts too. But maybe not for beach reading. I think that it's very true what you say. I mean, I think it's either a vicious circle or a virtuous circle. I mean, I think certainly the example of the position of Japanese writing in the West is very instructive here. I do feel that while Chinese fiction very often still plays to an empty house, I think that modern and contemporary Japanese writers have found an audience. And this very much is linked with Cold War history. So in the 1950s, big business publishers in the States, they had a big push producing high-quality literary translations of certain Japanese writers like Oe or like Mishima, in the interest of recasting Japan, no longer as a jingoistic, nationalistic threat, but as a Cold War ally, so kind of aesthetic, sensitive, slightly melancholy. So producing these top-quality literary translations was a big part of that. Arguably from that you can see Oe winning the Nobel Prize. You have people like Murakami and Banana Yoshimoto having audiences in the UK now. So, you know, these things take time. They take really significant investments and efforts of will by publishers. But I think maybe also a downside of this is that for UK and US audiences who are instinctively timid about reading translations, I think this big business push on Japanese literature has, well, for many years it created a slightly lazy shorthand in readers' minds that Japanese literature was about the human condition, sort of sensibilities and you know, these very universal themes, whereas of course at the same time Mao's bamboo curtain had clattered down around China. Until the 1980s, it was impossible for an Anglophone literary translator to have an independent relationship with a Chinese writer. So I think these two publishing trends created a kind of shorthand that Japanese literature is literary, whereas Chinese literature is kind of worthy and socio-political, but doesn't have a broader literary value. So I think we're still dealing with that legacy now, and I think it will take time.
Right.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, and it's one that comes up with translation a lot, and it's something which was touched on it in a seminar yesterday. There are lots of great endeavours and great work done by organisations, cultural embassies, and kind of organisations that showcase national literatures to the English-speaking world, and they're great. But the reality of the way that publishers work, in my experience, is publishers are very proactive. They know exactly what they want, and Common is just one example. Just as domestically, they don't take much from the slush pile. They often go out and proactively find writers and shape writers and build writers. The same applies to what they want from writers in translation. And it's not that they have to reach over and kind of control and manipulate and build a writer out in China. It's just that the message of what individual publishers want here needs to be translated and transmitted back into China and back into these other countries and cultures. As I say, there's lots of great work coming inwards, sort of showcasing collections and gatherings of writers from a Chinese point of view at an event like this. But what's needed is some mediation going the other way, because publishers are very proud of their particular brand and their particular style and what they're after. So there's work to be done there.
It's interesting because you're both talking about sort of, it seems to me, quite high-level thoughtfulness and strategy that sort of ends up creating a body of work that we can all take advantage of. And Marisha, I wonder if you could speak a little bit. Do you find this kind of support or this kind of thought going on behind the scenes? I mean, for example, in terms of the support for Chinese writers for translation coming from, I don't know, government agencies or anything else.
In China
yeah, can
or
you in China, but particularly concerned with bringing the work out into the world. Can you speak a little bit about that in answer to the question?
Well, I think coming from China, in China, there's a lot of support of trying to get Chinese writers into translation. So there is a very generous, I think, government fund set up by, I think it's JPP, where they do promote and will pay for translation. So there is a real push to try and show Chinese culture. So I do feel that. But with all of this, I think going back to what I was saying, it really is a matter of time. I think China hasn't been open for that long, really, and it's all going to take time, really, for it to get to a place where there is more Chinese literature. As you said, actually, it's not going to happen overnight. I mean, it's still a long journey to go. I mean, if you just think, there are still so many people who haven't been to China. I think if you've been to China, then you really do get a sense of what you're reading about. And I think it really puts it into context. So as people are traveling more and more, the process, I think then the bridges are kind of built, and it takes time.
And sorry, Julia.
Well, I would just say one thing, though, that because the base is still the base of Chinese literature in the UK and America is still relatively small. That's why I think the work of people like Marisha and Ra has such an impact, because every single book, every single short story that they get out there has a visible impact on how people are engaging on a very personal level with these very, personal impressions of China. So it means that, although there's still resistance, there's still obstacles. Everything that they do that Marisha and Ra do is of great significance.
That's a good question. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, sir. Wait for the microphone, I think. Sorry, this gentleman, and then we'll go to at the back. Sorry.
I'm a crime writer and I like reading foreign literature, but I also like watching the TV series. What sort of genres do the Chinese do, and do they put it onto a TV series or films that can that is a media that will display the work? I know personally I've been watching an Italian detective series, and that has inspired me to buy the books.
Okay. So, Marisha, can you help us answer that?
Interesting question. Well, there are a lot of sort of Western series that are brought into China that can be watched, as long as is my understanding. I'm based in Hong Kong. That's a really interesting question. Another thing that is watched is quite often, say, big-selling Chinese authors will then convert their novels into TV series. So I have one, Yang Geling, who's very known. Whenever she has a novel out, quite often the TV rights will be sold. So that is something else that's there's appetite for. But I don't know whether your question is really whether the TV is creating the reading tastes in China. I think that's what you're asking.
Works together.
Yeah.
I mean, one very prominent example is a spy writer called Mai Jia, who used to be in the secret services himself. I believe he was a code breaker. And I think over the last 10 years, he's made a new, very successful career for himself as a writer of these spy thrillers, very often set just before or during the Second World War or in the early decades of the PRC. And what, as I understand, really made these books become bestsellers, and he's famous for commanding the highest royalty rates in China, is that parallel with the books, there's a very, very successful series of TV adaptations for which he has himself written the screenplay. So, writers very much have they're very closely involved with the buying of the TV rights and also how their works are presented.
Thank you. The lady at the back had a question.
Okay, thank you. With the development of globalization and more practical translated works have greatly been increased. So how do you think, what are the most factors influence the literal translation in the globalized world? Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry, that was a bit noisy.
I'm
but-
sorry,
but-
it was
yeah,
very
could you
noisy.
make
Is
the-
your question about the future of literary works in the
Yeah.
globalized world? Okay, I think we touched on this a little bit early on in the conversation. Can I ask you just to sort of say, what do you mean specifically? Is there any future for literary works? Is that your question?
Yeah, I think with the development of the intercultural communication and much more practical translation, technical translation works have greatly been increased. So, in some cases, literal translation just are not paid much more attention to compare with the practical translation. So. So how do you think about the future of the literal translation?
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
I think this part of the conversation we had earlier on, but Julia, if you just want to sort of, I guess, sum up and respond.
I think that there's still very much a place for literary translation alongside the pie charts, alongside the articles about politics and economy. I think the main value of literary translation, it's a companion, it's a kind of antidote to the big stories about China. I mean, I write history books, which inevitably sometimes have to generalize, they have to extrapolate out from a wide body of information. At the same time, I'm a literary translator, and I find these two sorts of works complement each other perfectly. The literary translation being a real antidote to writing about the big themes, because with literary translation, you're forced to engage in an incredibly detailed way with just one person's take on, not on China, but on a tiny corner of China, and it just really keeps you grounded. So I think it's by continually accessing these personal stories about China that understanding between the West and China will be eased in a century that unfortunately, does promise quite severe, economic and political and perhaps even military competition between different parts of the world. So I think sort of literature and culture is a kind of essential, very personal antidote to the big stories.
Julia, thank you. I think that's a perfect note on which to end. And I'd like to thank Marisha, Ra, and Julia for joining us this morning. And thank you all very much. Have a great day. Thank you.
Could I just make one quick plug? Sorry, could I just make one quick plug? Sorry, very crude of me. Xi Cheng, this anthology of 10 city stories, is being launched tomorrow at 6:30 at the British Library, and you're all incredibly welcome. Thank you.